For 35 years, the barn was a door she could not open, a place her husband had forbidden her to enter. But in the silence that followed his funeral, she let her promise fall away like dust. And what she discovered inside brought her trembling to her knees. The old house was a stubborn memory etched against the edge of the prairie, a place where the winds of Kansas swept the fields clean and the sky was a vast, unending canvas in every direction. It was not a place of remarkable beauty, just a modest, single-story home with white paint cracking like old porcelain, a porch that groaned with every footstep, and a leaning mailbox that had surrendered to gravity long ago. But for Elara, it had once been a new beginning, a promise of a quieter life, a chance to build something true with a man whose actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She had arrived from the city of Crestwood years before, exchanging the relentless pulse of traffic, the cold logic of spreadsheets, and the confines of small apartments for the rich scent of soil and an ocean of silence. The change had been a shock at first, a jarring shift in rhythm. The sheer emptiness of the landscape had a way of making her feel small, and the quiet was a physical pressure against her skin, a tangible thing. Yet, over time, she came to see that old house as a place where roots could finally grow deep even when nothing else would. And at the very heart of that stillness, there was Silas. Silas was a man sculpted from few words, tall and square-shouldered, with hands that seemed permanently stained by the ghosts of grease and oil. His days were spent coaxing life back into engines at a service station 15 miles down the road. He wasn't affectionate in the way Elara had once dreamed love would be. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, only a steady, solid presence. He was the kind of man who always remembered to check the tires before a long drive, who never raised his voice, who would look you straight in the eye and say he'd be home by 7, and then he was. Their love had unfolded with a slow and gentle patience, a kind of patience neither of them knew they possessed. There were no whirlwind courtships or candlelit dinners, only the comforting rhythm of routine, morning coffee on the porch, wordless glances across the dinner table, the reassuring weight of her hand on his shoulder when his back gave him trouble. It was a life built not on grand moments, but on the accumulation of 1,000 small, quiet things. But there was one part of that life, one singular space, that remained sealed and firmly out of her reach. Behind the house, just beyond the tangled garden beds and a forgotten, rusted water barrel, stood the old barn. It wasn't a large structure, just a weather-beaten building of warped wooden boards and a roof that sagged on one side like a weary shoulder. The padlock on its heavy front door was newer than the barn itself, a piece of shiny brass that glinted in the sun, a constant winking secret. Elara had never once seen the key. She could still remember the very first time she asked him about it, back when they had just moved in, when she was still learning the language of the house, the creak of its floorboards and the way the wind would moan through the window panes in the dead of night. She had gestured toward the barn with a curious smile, her mind already racing with possibilities, imagining how they might restore it, perhaps transforming it into an art studio or a small guest house. But the way Silas responded had frozen the thought in her mind. "I'd rather you didn't go in there," he had said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's not safe. Just a lot of old equipment, loose nails, broken tools." She had laughed then, a light sound, thinking he was only teasing, but when she turned to look at him again, she saw the laughter die in his eyes. His face was a neutral mask, but his tone was a wall, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. That was the first time she felt a door close between them. Not a real door, not one of wood and hinges that you could see or touch, but a door that was just as real, just as solid. At first she didn't let it trouble her. Men need their spaces, she'd reasoned, their own private corners of the world. And if he needed a place to tinker with his thoughts or simply to be alone, she could accept that. Everyone has their secrets. Doesn't everyone have those little corners of the self they keep locked away? But as the years dissolved one into the next, the barn grew into something more than just a forbidden space. It became a question mark that lived permanently in the back of her mind, a question that was always unanswered. She began to notice things, small things, the kind of details that burrow under your skin. The way he would sometimes slip out the back door late at night, a flashlight cutting a nervous beam through the darkness, only to return 15, maybe 20 minutes later. He never offered an explanation, and she, in turn, never asked. Not in the beginning. And then there were the packages, strangely shaped boxes that would arrive once or twice a year, always addressed only to him, always clutched tightly under his arm and carried directly to the barn. She never once saw what was inside. When she finally mentioned it, he would just shrug. Just tools, he'd say, or stuff for work, and the conversation would end as abruptly as it began. One sweltering afternoon, about 6 years into their marriage, she found herself walking around the side of the barn, determined to see inside. She tried to peer through a grimy window, the glass clouded with decades of dust and neglect, but she pressed her face against it anyway, cupping her hand to block the glare. Inside she could only make out vague, shadowy shapes, shelves, perhaps, or a workbench, but nothing she could truly identify. The darkness within was absolute, a deep and stubborn blackness, as if the place itself did not want to be seen. After that day, she stopped trying. She told herself it was foolish, that she trusted him, and most days she truly did. But the barn remained with her, a silent presence, like a word on the very tip of her tongue that she could never quite recall. They settled deeper into their routine. She took a part-time job at the town library. He kept his position at the station. On Sundays, they attended church and then stopped for pie at the local diner. No one looking in from the outside would have ever guessed that a single locked door could create such a vast and echoing silence between two people who loved each other. And still the door remained locked. Over time, her curiosity began to curdle into something else. It was not suspicion, not really. She never believed he was hiding something terrible. Not another woman, not a secret vice. This felt deeper. Something older than their marriage, something that had belonged to him long before she ever did. Sometimes her imagination would run wild. Perhaps it was a shrine to a lost love, a collection of letters he couldn't bring himself to destroy. Or maybe it was something darker, a guilt he carried from a life before they met. But no matter how vivid her theories became, they always crashed against the same reality. Her, standing outside the door, her hand hovering over the latch, unable and unwilling to go any further. One night they sat together on the porch, watching the sky bleed into a soft violet behind the whispering cornfields. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and dry grass. She turned to him, the question rising once more. "Why won't you let me see it?" she asked, and it was not the first time. He didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his beer, the glass bottle sweating in the humid air, and stared out into the deepening twilight. "It's just not something I'm ready to share," he said at last, his voice quiet but final. "Maybe not ever." She wanted to ask more, to push, to demand, but there was a finality in his tone that silenced her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hiding in the defensive way that liars hide. He was protecting something. She just had no idea what it was. Through the years, they tried and failed to have children. There were fertility tests, long drives to specialists in Meridian, calendars marked with hopeful circles, and the crushing weight of dashed expectations. The grief would arrive in silent waves, a sorrow that was mostly unspoken. Eventually, they stopped talking about it altogether. Instead, they allowed the silence to grow between them, like ivy climbing the side of the house, creeping into every corner, finding every crack. And still the barn stood, a constant presence in her line of sight, a structure that loomed far larger than its physical size. She began to consciously avoid looking at it, because to see it felt like a small betrayal. One morning she found herself standing before it again, not because she had intended to walk there, but because her feet seemed to know the way on their own. She touched the padlock gently, a soft questioning gesture, as if it might yield to kindness. It did not. It was just cold and hard in her hand. The smell of old wood and the passage of time enveloped her. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, what secrets could be so precious, so painful, that not even love could unlock the door. That night, as they sat down to dinner, she saw something different in Silas's face. He looked tired in a way she had never seen before, not the simple exhaustion of work or weather, but something deeper, a weariness that came from the inside. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded but didn't speak. She let it go. She always let it go. But something was changing. The silence was growing heavier, more dense. The barn was no longer just a mystery. It had become a wall, and she didn't know how much longer she could bear to live with it. The summer after Elora turned 36 was hotter than any she could recall. The fields surrounding their home turned a scorched brown. Long before their time, the grass became brittle and sharp underfoot, and even the nights offered no real escape from the heat. The air was heavy, clinging to the house like a second skin, thick and suffocating. It was during this oppressive season, with ceiling fans spinning uselessly and cold showers providing only fleeting comfort, that she realized something fundamental had shifted between them. It hadn't happened dramatically, not overnight, but with the slow, relentless erosion of a shoreline worn away by endless waves. The barn remained locked, a constant, silent fixture in the background, like a still photograph hanging just at the edge of her vision. But now it was more than just a curiosity. It had transformed into a symbol, not just of his secrecy, but of something essential that was missing between them, something that had gone unspoken for far too long. And the deeper truth, the one she had not yet dared to say aloud even to herself, was that the barn wasn't the only closed door in their lives. They had been trying to conceive a child for nearly 7 years. It had started simply, without the clinical precision of charts or thermometers, just a hopeful shrug and the quiet belief that what was meant to happen would happen. But it didn't. First came the patient waiting, which slowly gave way to a quiet wondering. A year dissolved into the past, and she brought it up casually, her tone light, half-joking. Another year slipped by, and they were scheduling appointments, sitting in clinics with waiting rooms painted in hopeful pastels, surrounded by other couples who wore the same fragile, uncertain expressions. Elora remembered the words from the specialist in Meridian. Unexplained infertility, they had called it, as if giving the void a name was any kind of answer at all. Nothing was technically wrong with either of them, the doctor had said, and yet month after agonizing month ended in the same hollow way, with absence. There were no plus signs, no second pink lines, no late-night celebrations or whispered, joyful news. There was only silence. She bore the weight of it quietly at first, convincing herself that their time would eventually come. But as the years continued to trickle away, she began to feel defective, as if her own body were betraying some ancient, sacred promise it was supposed to fulfill. She kept a small, hidden box of baby clothes in the back of the closet. Tiny things she had bought in the early days, when hope still felt like a solid, tangible thing, a pair of impossibly soft socks, a onesie decorated with cartoon bears, a pacifier still sealed in its mint green packaging. Every few months she would take them out, run her fingers over the soft fabric, and then put them back, a secret ritual of grief, as though nothing had happened. Silas rarely spoke of it. He never blamed her, never once expressed his disappointment, but his silence was a weight of its own. Whenever she brought up another test, another procedure, another glimmer of possibility, he would simply nod without commitment, like someone listening to a story they had already heard too many times. He went to the appointments. He filled out the form, but emotionally he remained just out of reach, as remote and inaccessible as the barn itself. She longed for more than his passive agreement. She yearned to hear him say that it mattered to him, that he felt the ache of it too. But all he ever gave her was his quiet presence. And while that had once been a source of comfort, it now began to feel like absence cleverly disguised as support. She tried to keep herself busy. The library job gave her days a structure, but there were long, slow afternoons where she would shelve books mechanically, her mind drifting away to parallel lives, to versions of herself with a stroller, with a diaper bag slung over her shoulder, with the sound of laughter echoing through the empty rooms of their house. The dreams clung to her like cobwebs she could never quite shake off. Silas, for his part, grew more withdrawn, though he was never unkind. He still brought her coffee in the mornings, still fixed things around the house without being asked, but he no longer lingered at the table after dinner. He would disappear into the backyard, into the barn, and stay there until well after the sun had set. When she asked what he was doing, he gave the same vague answers as always. Just cleaning up, ja, or just organizing. There was never any emotion, never any elaboration. Once, in a moment of raw, unguarded honesty, she pressed her palm flat against the barn door, feeling its warmth soak into her skin from the afternoon sun. She imagined what might be behind it, not with the fanciful wonder of her earlier years, but with a kind of creeping dread. Maybe he had built something in there. Maybe he had created a space where the child they never had could exist, if only within the confines of his imagination. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. It felt too painful, too intimate, like trespassing on a private grief. They no longer spoke about children. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the peaceful, comfortable quiet they once shared on the porch swing or during long drives. Now it was filled with things unsaid, things deliberately avoided. It had sharp edges. Elora began to notice how Silas touched her less, not out of rejection, but with a kind of careful reverence that bordered on distance. He would kiss her forehead, like one might gently close a book they no longer had the heart to read. There were moments when she wanted to scream, to shout at the wide, empty sky, to shatter something just to watch it break. But those moments always passed, and she would return to the quiet rhythm of their days. The house still needed cleaning. The groceries still needed buying. The grass still grew. Life, despite everything, simply went on. On their 12th anniversary, Silas brought home a cake from the diner. He didn't bake, never had, but she appreciated the small gesture. They ate it in the kitchen, the sound of their forks scraping against the paper plates filling the silence, and for a few minutes it felt almost like it used to. She looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to read the story on his face. He looked tired, not in a physical way, but in a way that went much deeper, like someone who carried something so heavy for so long that it had become a part of his posture. Later that night, as they lay in bed with the windows open to the night breeze, she turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He stared at the dark ceiling for a long time before finally answering. "Every day," he said, and that was all. The next morning she watched him from the kitchen window as he made his way across the yard, coffee mug in hand, his steps slower and heavier than they used to be. He paused by the barn, reached into his pocket, and unlocked the heavy door. He disappeared inside, and the door swung shut behind him with its familiar, mournful groan. She stood there, unmoving, the mug cooling in her hands, thinking about all the things they had built together and all the things they hadn't. That evening she tried to talk to him again. Not about the barn, not directly, but about the growing distance between them, about how it felt to live in a house haunted by the ghost of a child they'd never had. She chose her words with care, trying not to sound accusatory, trying to keep the raw hurt from taking over her voice. He listened. He always listened. But his answers were short, measured, and offered no comfort. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wish I had more to give." It wasn't the response she wanted. It wasn't anger or even dismissal. It was resignation, a quiet surrender to the life they had ended up with. After he went to bed, she wandered out into the backyard. The stars were out, a brilliant cold spray against the black velvet of the sky, and the barn stood dark and still beneath their distant glow. She walked right up to it, placing her hand on the door once more. It was cool now, the heat of the day long gone. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood and closed her eyes. "What are you keeping in there, Silas?" She whispered to no one in particular. She knew he wasn't hiding anything malicious. He was not a man with skeletons in his closet. But he was a man with a deep and abiding sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, that was worse. Maybe whatever lived and breathed behind that locked door was a reflection of something he couldn't bear to share. Not because he didn't trust her, but because sharing it would hurt too much. She turned away and went back inside the silent house. She wouldn't ask him again, not yet. But the question had rooted itself deeper inside her than ever, and though she didn't realize it then, the answer would eventually come. It would come too late for the asking, but not too late for understanding. The first sign was so small, so utterly ordinary, that Alara almost dismissed it. Silas had always been a strong man, not just in his physical build, but in the deliberate, grounded way he moved through the world. He could climb ladders without a hint of hesitation, lift heavy toolboxes with ease, and work from sunrise to sunset, with barely a word of complaint. So when she first noticed him rubbing his lower back after standing up from the dinner table, she brushed it aside as nothing more than a pulled muscle or the result of a long day at the garage. But then it happened again and again. Soon it wasn't just his back. Other signs began to appear, subtle at first, then more insistent, a loss of appetite, a deep fatigue that lingered even after a full night's sleep. The healthy color in his face began to dull, and his confident steps lost their easy rhythm. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would see him wince, a sharp intake of breath at sudden pains that gripped him in the middle of emotion. Alara urged him to see a doctor, gently at first, then with more firmness in her voice. Silas resisted. He insisted it was just age, that everyone slowed down eventually, that she was worrying for nothing. But his shirts began to hang looser on his frame, and dark bruised circles formed beneath his eyes. She couldn't ignore it any longer. One afternoon she made the appointment herself. When she told him, he didn't argue. That silence frightened her more than anything. They drove to the city 2 days later. The waiting room at the clinic was sterile and cold, despite the cheerful, generic artwork on the walls. Alara filled out the forms while Silas sat silently beside her, his hands folded neatly in his lap. When the nurse finally called his name, he gave her a small, tight nod and followed her down the hall without a single look back. She waited alone. An hour crawled by, then another. Finally the doctor emerged, his expression unreadable, a careful mask. They sat in a small beige room with a ticking clock that seemed to amplify the silence. The words came slowly, cautiously, wrapped in medical jargon that did little to soften the blow. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, inoperable. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Alara heard the words, but they didn't land all at once. It was like standing on a shore and watching a monstrous wave rise impossibly high, knowing it would inevitably crash, but being utterly unable to move. Silas didn't speak. He only nodded, his face strangely calm, as if he had already known, as if he had been waiting for the words to finally catch up with the truth his body had been telling him. The drive home was a vacuum of silence. Neither of them spoke a word. The fields passed by in blurs of gold and green, the sky stretching wide and heartless above them. When they finally reached the house, Silas got out of the car and walked inside without waiting for her. She followed, her fingers trembling as they closed around the door handle. In the days that followed, he refused any further treatment. No chemotherapy, no radiation. He told her he didn't want to spend whatever time he had left lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms. He wanted to be at home, in his own bed, with his own coffee cup on the table, and the familiar sound of the creaking porch beneath his feet. Alara didn't argue. She couldn't. If their positions had been reversed, she might have made the same choice. And so she became his caretaker. She organized his medications, adjusted his diet, and helped him move around the house when he grew too weak to manage on his own. She learned how to check his vitals, how to manage his pain. At night she would sit beside his bed, sometimes reading aloud, other times just holding his hand as he drifted into a restless, shallow sleep. The decline was both mercifully fast and agonizingly slow. Some days he was lucid and talkative, even cracking dry jokes that were a faint echo of the man he used to be. On other days he barely opened his eyes. His body withered before her very eyes, and no matter how tightly she held on, she couldn't stop the inevitable unraveling. It was during one of the better days, if such a thing could be said to exist, that he brought up the barn again. She had been helping him into his chair on the porch when he placed his hand lightly on her wrist. His grip was weak, but his intention was clear. "If something happens," he said, his voice as thin as the wind, "don't go in there." Alara looked at him, startled. She hadn't thought about the barn in weeks. Her mind had been consumed with pill schedules, doctor's calls, and the constant dull ache of anticipatory grief. The barn had faded into the background noise of their life. "I'm serious," he added, his gaze locking with hers. "Promise me. Even after I'm gone." She wanted to ask why, to finally demand the truth that had stood between them for so long. But something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't fear. It was sorrow, a deep ancient sorrow that she could feel but not understand. She nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I promise." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she said them anyway. That night, as she helped him settle into bed, he whispered something else, a phrase so faint she could barely hear it. "I kept it for us," he said. "You might not understand, but I had to." He drifted off to sleep before she could ask what he meant. The following weeks were a blur of decline. Silas slept more than he was awake. His voice grew fainter, his skin cooler to the touch. Elara stayed by his side through it all, holding on to his hand as if it were the last thing anchoring her to the earth. Then one morning he was gone. He passed away in his sleep, his hand still curled loosely in hers. There was no drama, no final gasp, only a profound silence, a final, irreversible silence. The house felt unbearably quiet in the days that followed. She handled the funeral arrangements with the detached efficiency of someone moving through deep water. The service was small. A few neighbors came, a co-worker from the garage, a distant cousin she barely remembered. She stood alone by the grave, the wind tugging at her coat as the pastor said a few solemn words. She didn't cry, not then. Her grief hadn't found a place to land yet. It hovered just outside of her reach, like a storm waiting for its moment to break. When she returned home, the first thing she saw from the kitchen window was the barn, still standing, still locked, still waiting. At first she tried to avoid it. She focused on sorting through his things, boxing up clothes, going through drawers. But everywhere she turned there were reminders: his shaving kit on the bathroom shelf, his boots by the back door, the faint scent of him that still clung to the flannel shirts she could not yet bring herself to wash. Each day the barn seemed to draw her gaze more insistently. It was no longer just a question. It was the only question left. What had he kept from her for all those years? What truth had he carried with him to his grave? She would wake in the middle of the night and find herself standing at the window, her eyes fixed on the dark, silent outline of the structure. Once she walked out barefoot across the dew-soaked grass and stood before it, trembling in the cool night air. She touched the lock, half expecting it to fall open at her touch. But she didn't enter. Not yet. She had made a promise, and even in death it held her. But the weight of that promise was becoming unbearable. One morning she found herself sitting on the porch, staring at the barn as the sun rose behind it, casting long dark shadows across the yard. She clutched her coffee cup so tightly, her knuckles turned white, as if the warmth could keep her from unraveling. She thought about the way Silas had looked at her in those final days, not with guilt, but with a kind of desperate tenderness, as though he wanted to shield her from something he believed she wasn't strong enough to bear. But she was strong. She had stood by him through the worst of it. She had watched the man she loved fade into dust, and had still managed to wake up the next day. And now all that remained of his secret was a locked door. The promise she had made was beginning to feel less like an act of respect and more like a chain. She whispered his name into the pale morning light. Then she stood, and with a deep, steadying breath, she walked toward the barn. The grass was still wet with morning dew when Elara stepped off the porch and moved across the backyard. She wore one of Silas's old flannel shirts over her nightdress, its sleeves rolled clumsily above her wrists. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, and the sky glowed a soft, indifferent gray. Each step she took brought a low, chill dampness to her ankles, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were locked on the barn. It stood just as it always had, weather-worn and slumped at the corners, as if bowing to the weight of the years that had passed. The padlock on the door still hung where it had always been, dulled now from time, flecked with spots of rust. The sight of it sent a small, silent tremor through her chest. She had promised him she wouldn't enter. But what did a promise truly mean when the person it was made to was no longer here to hold it? The wind whispered through the cornfield behind the house. a soft sighing sound, carrying with it the scent of soil and some faint, distant memory. She paused at the door, her fingers grazing the cold metal of the lock. For a fleeting moment she imagined his voice again, gentle but firm. "Don't go in there." Even now his absence felt less like a void and more like a shadow that lingered in every corner of the property. And standing here, her hand on the one thing he had kept from her all these years, she felt as if he were still watching. Elora reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. She had found it 3 nights after the funeral, tucked inside an unmarked envelope in the drawer of his nightstand. She hadn't touched it until now. Holding it in her palm, it felt like holding a live wire, as if the mere act of possession would rupture something sacred. But this morning was different. The stillness in the house had begun to feel suffocating. The lonely echo of her own footsteps, the profound absence of his breath in the bedroom, the untouched coffee mug by the sink, it had all begun to press in on her, a physical weight against her chest. She needed air, and more than that, she needed answers. The key slid into the lock easily, almost too easily, as though it had been waiting for her all this time. With a dull, heavy click, the latch gave way. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, and then she pushed the heavy door open. The scent hit her first, not the smell of rot or mold she might have expected, but of dust and old wood and something else, something unexpectedly sweet, like honey and aging paper. Faint light filtered in through the crooked slats in the walls, casting long, dusty stripes across the floor. For a moment she just stood in the threshold, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't a workshop. There were no oil drums, no rusted tools or scattered car parts like she had so often imagined. Instead, the space opened gently into something else entirely, something so heartbreakingly unexpected it stole the air from her lungs. On the far wall, dozens of children's drawings were pinned neatly in rows. Bright, uneven sketches in crayon and marker, stick figures holding hands, a lopsided yellow sun beaming in the corner of a page, a dog with big brown spots and a blue collar. And above them, written in large, careful letters, were words that made her knees go weak. "For Mom and Dad, I love you. Our family." Beneath the gallery of drawings sat a small bookshelf filled to bursting with well-worn picture books and soft, plush toys. A battered teddy bear with one ear nearly torn off leaned against the side. A wooden train set snaked across the floor nearby, poised as if someone had only just left the room and might return at any moment to resume their play. And in the corner there was a crib. A real wooden crib, sanded smooth and painted a soft white, though the paint had begun to peel in places. A small hand-knitted blanket lay folded inside, and on the pillow sat a stuffed elephant, its floppy ears sagging, but its button eyes still seeming to watch her with a gentle, alert expression. The sight of it all made her press a hand to her chest, a physical effort to hold herself together. This wasn't just a storage space. This was a nursery. She stepped forward slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile spell of the room. Each footstep stirred the dust on the floor, sending it swirling in thin, dancing tendrils through the shafts of light. The air was warm, settled, and strangely familiar. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a mobile that hung above the crib. It was made of wooden stars, carved and painted by hand, suspended by bits of weathered string. They turned gently in the draft from the open door, as if moved by a silent breath. It didn't make sense. None of it made any sense at all. They had never had children. They had tried year after agonizing year, until hope had withered into an old wound they both agreed to stop touching. And yet here, in this secret room he had built behind a locked door, Silas had created a world where their child had existed. On a small table next to the crib sat a notebook, a simple spiral-bound school notebook, the kind she remembered from her own childhood. Its blue cover was faded, its corners soft and curled. She picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. At the top, written in his neat, blocky handwriting, were the words, "Diary of a Father. For you, my child, if you ever find this." Elora sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. She turned the pages slowly, each line of ink revealing a piece of a world she never knew he carried inside him. The first entries were cautious, uncertain. Today I built the crib. I don't know if it's silly, if I'm just setting myself up for more heartbreak, but I needed to do something with my hands. I needed to believe it could happen. That you could happen. Your mother doesn't know. I don't think she'd understand. I don't think I even understand, but every nail I drove into that wood, it felt like I was building more than just a piece of furniture. I was building hope. She read on, and the entries grew more detailed, more confident. He wrote about imagined milestones, first words, first steps, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. He had given the child a name, though it was never the same one, twice. Sometimes it was Ben, sometimes Grace, sometimes just you. He wrote about the profound joy he felt just thinking about being a father, and the deep, hollow ache that came each time reality reminded him that it might never happen. I bought the elephant today. He has kind eyes. He'll guard your dreams, little one. I watched your mother planting sunflowers today. She looked so tired. I wanted to tell her that I still believe, but the words caught in my throat. So I came in here and wrote them down instead. Some days, I swear I can hear your laughter. I know it's crazy, but it keeps me going. Elara closed the notebook, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She looked around the room again, and now she saw it with new eyes. Every object, every carefully placed toy and lovingly pinned drawing was a testament to his quiet, unspoken grief, and to his love, a love that was deep, patient, and unwavering. He hadn't kept her out of the barn to punish her or to hide something dark and shameful. He had done it to protect the dream he had so carefully built when life had given them no other option. A dream that was too fragile, too precious, to survive outside the shelter of these four walls. A sob escaped her, sharp and sudden, tearing from a place deep inside her that had been silent for too long. She pressed her forehead against the cool, smooth edge of the crib, her tears soaking into the old wood. The grief she had buried for years, for decades, came rushing out all at once. Grief for the child they never had, grief for the man who had carried the crushing weight of that loss entirely alone, and grief for the woman she had been, blind for so long to the true depth of his sorrow. She sat there for hours as the sun rose higher in the sky, warming the roof of the barn, and the dust motes began to glow in the strengthening light. She didn't move. She didn't need to. For the first time since his death, she felt like she was truly in his presence again. Eventually, she stood and wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked slowly around the room, touching everything. Each toy, each book, each small piece of the life he had so vividly imagined for them. This place, once forbidden and mysterious, had become sacred. She left the barn door open when she walked out. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the pages of the notebook she had left on the table. And though the space was empty, it no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. For days after discovering the barn, Elara drifted through the house like a sleepwalker. The world outside kept moving on its axis. Neighbors mowed their lawns, trucks rumbled down the country roads. The shelves at the town's grocery store shifted subtly with the change of season. But inside her world, time had collapsed. She had found the epicenter of Silas's silence, the place where all the words he had never said had gathered like rain in a hidden well, and now they echoed in her mind with a painful, beautiful clarity. She returned to the barn each morning, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with trembling hands and an ache in her chest that refused to leave. The more she read of the notebook, the more she began to understand the man she had married and the profound depth of his quiet sorrow. His words were not rehearsed or poetic. They were simple, steady, and filled with an almost unbearable longing. Not once in all those pages did he blame her for the life they couldn't build together. He never even blamed himself. Instead, he had used the diary as a way to speak to someone who had never existed, but who was loved all the same. She read passages about how he had chosen the crib's design, wanting something sturdy but with soft, rounded edges, because he imagined their child would one day chew on the rails. She read about the nights he had snuck out while she was asleep to work on the drawings he tacked to the walls, pretending they had been done by small, clumsy hands and not his own. She read about the teddy bear he had rescued from a thrift store bin, the picture books he had bought in secret, the quilt he had tried to stitch himself before giving up and ordering one online. One page stood out more than any other. It was written shakily, the pen strokes faint and uneven. You won't know me, not really, but I knew you. Every inch of you, even though I never saw your face. I knew your laugh. I heard it in the wind. I knew the feel of your hand, because sometimes I imagined you gripping my finger as I carried you across the yard. I knew the weight of you, asleep against my chest, even though that weight was made only of memory and air. You were mine, even if just in here, and I'm sorry. So sorry that I couldn't make you real. There was no signature, just the date scribbled almost illegibly at the bottom, dated just a few weeks before the cancer had taken him. Elara closed the notebook with a quiet reverence, as if she were sealing a prayer. Her fingertips lingered on the worn cover, and for the first time in years, she did not feel alone in her grief. It was shared now, carried in every corner of the barn, in every dust-covered toy and faded pencil drawing. Silas had not merely escaped to this place. He had survived here, building something enduring and beautiful out of the void they had both silently carried. Memories began to stitch themselves together in her mind, moments that had once seemed small and inconsequential, but now flickered with a new, poignant meaning. She remembered the first time he had brought home a large, plain cardboard box without explanation. She had asked what it was, and he had smiled a tired, distant smile and said, "Just something for the garage." She remembered how late at night he would lie beside her, with his eyes open, unmoving, his breathing slow and measured, as if he were holding back some internal storm. She remembered how he had watched children playing in the park, not with envy or bitterness, but with a quiet, hollow ache in his eyes that were soft and completely unreadable. All along, he had been building a world for the child they could never have. Not to replace that child, not to deny their reality, but to hold on to some piece of it in a way that wouldn't drown him. She had mourned in silence, and so had he, but they had been speaking completely different languages. Her grief had been inward, pressed down and hidden beneath the relentless routines of daily life. His had become this room. She returned to the barn every afternoon, sometimes just to sit in the quiet. There were no ghosts there, no whispers in the corners, only the steady hum of the wind through the boards and the scent of pine and paper and the passage of time. She dusted the bookshelf, rearranged the stuffed animals, straightened the mobile when it tilted. She began to treat the space not as a museum of pain, but as a living memory, a testament to hope, to love, to Silas's unspoken dream. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the floor, she found a second notebook tucked behind the crib, thinner than the first. It contained only a few entries, but they cut deeper than all the rest. In them, Silas had begun writing to her. "I don't know if you'll ever find this, Elara, or if you'll understand, but I've always loved you more than I could ever say. I didn't tell you about this place because I wanted to spare you. I didn't want to see that look in your eyes, the one you wear when you think you've failed. You didn't. None of this was ever your fault. I built this room for me, for us, for what could have been. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry for all the things I didn't say." Elara read the entry slowly, tears streaking silently down her cheeks, blurring the words until they swam in waves of ink. She held the notebook against her chest, her heart aching with a strange, unexpected blend of profound sorrow and deep peace. He had loved her, not just in the way he'd shown with his actions and his steadiness, but in ways he had buried so deeply that only now, in his absence, had they finally been unearthed. She began to bring pieces of her own memory into the space. From the attic she retrieved a dusty box of items from her own childhood. A faded doll, a plastic ring from a cereal box, a faded photograph of her father holding her up to touch the high branches of a tree. She placed them gently among Silas's objects, side by side. It was no longer just his dream. It was becoming something shared. The neighbors began to notice a change. Mrs. Gable, who lived 3 houses down, waved with a brighter smile when Elara passed by. The librarian at the town branch asked if she might be interested in helping with the new children's story hour. Even the cashier at the grocery store commented that she looked more like herself again. It wasn't joy that they saw, not exactly. It was presence. Alara had returned from wherever her grief had taken her. Not whole, not yet, but mending. Each evening she returned to the barn to write. She picked up where Silas had left off, using the same notebooks, mimicking his careful handwriting. She wrote to the child they never had, told stories about the life they might have lived, described the days as they were now, quiet, healing, full of gentle echoes. Sometimes she imagined Silas, reading over her shoulder, nodding in that calm, steady way of his, as if to say, "Yes, that's right. Keep going." It was in that same spirit that she began to consider the world outside their home again, not with dread, but with a quiet, tentative yearning. The idea came to her slowly, forming like condensation on a cold window pane. Maybe there were other children out there, not hers by blood, but in need of the kind of love that Silas had tried to give. Not to fill the space he had left behind, but to honor the dream that had once lived in secret. She began researching local foster programs, looking into volunteer opportunities at group homes. She wasn't ready to make a decision, not yet. But for the first time, she was ready to think about it, and that was a start. The barn, once a place of solitude and secrecy, had become her sanctuary. She hung soft curtains over the windows, letting more light stream in. She replaced the flickering overhead bulb with a warmer lamp. She began reading aloud from the picture books on the shelf, not because anyone was there to listen, but because it felt right. Because sound, a gentle, loving sound, belonged in that space now. Silas had not been a father in the traditional sense, but he had loved as one, had hoped as one, had grieved as one. And in those pages, in those hand-carved stars and scribbled drawings, he had become one. That was the truth Alara carried with her now. Not the tragedy of what they had lost, but the quiet, enduring triumph of the love they had managed to keep alive, even when life had told them no. She stepped out of the barn one evening, the air cool against her skin, the last golden light of the day stretching long and low across the field. Behind her, the wind rustled the mobile gently, and ahead of her, the world waited. The days grew longer as spring yielded to summer. Sunlight lingered long past dinner, casting warm amber hues over the fields and filtering through the gauzy curtains Alara had hung in the barn's windows. The house remained quiet, but the quiet no longer felt heavy with loss. It was no longer an absence, no longer the hollow echo of something missing. Instead, it had softened into something calm, something reverent, like the hush inside a chapel, or the gentle peace that follows laughter when the heart is full and still. Each morning now began the same way. Alara would rise before the heat of the day settled in, make her coffee, and walk barefoot across the cool grass to the barn. Sometimes she brought a fresh notebook. Sometimes she brought the old one, the one still bearing Silas's handwriting, its cover grown soft from the constant touch of her fingers. She would sit in the rocking chair she had placed near the crib, an old wooden chair she had pulled from storage and sanded down, its familiar creak now a comforting rhythm, and she would write. She wrote to Silas, to the child that never was, and to herself. She wrote of memories and dreams, of new thoughts and quiet revelations. Some days her entries were long and winding, and other days they were just a single line. "I miss you. I'm okay. I see you in the wind." She no longer cried when she entered the barn. The grief, while still present, had woven itself into the fabric of her daily rituals, a constant undercurrent that no longer threatened to overwhelm her. The space had transformed, not only in its appearance, but in its meaning. It had become a sanctuary, not just of what had been lost, but of what still could be. The community, once a distant blur outside her window, began to gently pull her back into itself. It started small. At the local farmer's market, a young mother with 2 toddlers asked if Alara could hold her baby while she wrangled a cart of produce. Alara said yes, almost without thinking, and as the small, warm weight settled into her arms, she felt the stir of something quiet and powerful beneath her ribs. Not pain, but a gentle readiness. At the library, the director asked if she would be willing to host the children's story hour during the summer. The last volunteer had moved away, and the program needed someone warm, someone steady. Ilara hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She spent hours preparing, selecting books that had once filled Silas's makeshift nursery, books he had lovingly chosen in the hope of a bedtime that would never come. The first session was nerve-wracking. Her voice trembled slightly as she read, but the children listened with wide, curious eyes and open, trusting faces. Their laughter filled the small room, bright and unfiltered, and for the first time in years, Ilara laughed with them. Not the polite, strained smile she had worn in grocery store aisles and church pews, but real, spontaneous laughter that left her breathless and blinking back tears. She began volunteering at the local foster agency on the weekends. It started with organizing donations and cleaning the playrooms, but before long, she was sitting with children during visitation hours, reading to them, helping with their homework. Some of them were quiet and guarded, others wild and unfiltered. All of them were hungry for something: attention, safety, understanding. Ilara gave what she could, and in return, they gave her moments of pure connection, of unexpected grace. The idea of adopting a child herself still lived far off in the distance, like a mountain on the horizon, visible, possible, but not yet within reach. She didn't rush toward it. She wasn't trying to fill the space Silas had left behind. That space belonged to him, and always would. But the love he had left with her, that quiet, enduring, dream-shaped love, was too large to contain within herself. It needed somewhere to go. One afternoon, while cleaning the barn, Ilara came across a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked beneath a shelf hidden behind a stack of old blankets. Inside were dozens of slips of folded paper, and on each one Silas had written a child's imagined name. Some were common: Emma, Jack, Lily, while others were unusual, whimsical, clearly born of hope and fantasy: Cypress, Halo, Orion. On the back of each slip he had written traits: strong laugh, love stars, curious and brave. It was as if he had conjured 1,000 different versions of the child he would never meet, and had given each one a name, a personality, a life. Ilara spread them out on the rug, touching each one with gentle fingers. She wept quietly, not from pain, but from the sheer overwhelming beauty of it, of how much space one single heart could hold. She gathered the slips into a large glass jar and placed it on the shelf next to the books, a tribute, a constellation of the children they had never met, but who had existed for them nonetheless. That evening she made her way back to the house just as the sun began to lower, casting long, golden beams across the prairie. She paused on the porch steps, looking back at the barn. Its door stood open just slightly, enough for the light from the lamp inside to spill out like warmth. It no longer looked like a forgotten relic. It looked like a living place, a space that breathed and held memories. She went into the kitchen and brewed tea, the scent of chamomile rising into the still air. On the table lay the latest letter from the foster agency. They were organizing a summer outing for the children and needed volunteers to chaperone, a picnic by the river, with games and lunch under the trees. She touched the paper lightly, then reached for a pen and wrote her name on the sign-up form. That night, sleep came easily. She dreamed of Silas, not as he had been in those final days, frail and fading, but as he was in the beginning, strong, steady, his eyes full of quiet mischief. In the dream, he stood beside her in the barn, one hand resting lightly on the crib, the other holding hers. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. She felt everything he wanted to say in the way his thumb traced the back of her hand. When she woke, the warmth of his touch remained. A week later, a traveling puppet theater came to the town green. It was the kind of event she and Silas might have once wandered past on an evening walk, pausing just long enough to listen before continuing on their way home. This time she walked purposefully toward the crowd and found a spot on the grass among the children and their families. She sat cross-legged, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching as the puppets danced and tumbled across the tiny stage. The children around her squealed with laughter, their voices rising in pure, unadulterated delight. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, one small child, barefoot and tousle-haired, left his group and climbed directly into her lap without a single word. He leaned back against her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Elara didn't move. She simply wrapped her arms around him and watched the rest of the show. In that moment, something shifted deep inside her. Not suddenly, not explosively, but like a door that had long been closed, creaking slowly open. She didn't know who the boy was. She didn't need to. What she felt wasn't replacement or recovery. It was presence. It was light. When the show ended, the child ran back to his group without so much as a backward glance. Elara remained on the grass for a long time, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the stage as the puppeteers began to pack away their magical world. That night she returned to the barn as the sky deepened into a soft violet. She lit the small lamp by the crib, sat in her rocker, and opened her notebook. The page was blank, waiting. She pressed her pen to the paper, and the words began to flow. You never lived in this house, not in the way we dreamed, but you lived in him. And now you live in me. You were loved. You are loved. That makes you real. She paused, letting the ink settle, then continued. We are still here, and the world is still full of light. The barn held its silence. The stars blinked into existence in the night sky one by one, and the darkness wrapped gently around her like a promise finally kept.